Welcome back, Jialing Zhang. Does he look familiar? This is Brian Stye, of course, is one of the film subjects. He and his wife are founders of DNAconnect.org. The mission is to provide information to adopted children about their birth stories and their histories. And Brian, welcome to you. Thanks for being with us. I'm hoping that you will join us with questions and comments. It is a really powerful story, obviously, and so I would like to get a sense of your reaction and the questions you might have. I'll start. Jialing, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that Nan Fu and I were talking about in our interview about the film was, she mentioned, and some of you who heard it, she talked about how when somebody had asked her about the policy, she didn't think it had affected her life. She wasn't sure what the connection might be. She didn't know any of those stories at the time. And I'm wondering, what is it for you? What about for you? What did you know about the policy, think about the policy, think about its effect on you and your family? How are you thinking about it? What's your part in that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, for me, actually, I really never thought about this question because it was like a fact, like growing up, there's a policy. In China, we have a lot of policy, and there's propaganda on all those kind of policies. And one-child policy was one of it. And how it affected me, I just remember going to school that there's that ideology class that teach you that how the policy benefit the whole nation and people who don't follow the policy, they are like backwards thinking. And that affects me personally because I have a brother, and then it made me feel that, oh, my parents was like, they're not advanced thinking. But as a child in China, you really don't think too much about it. You just have felt that tension inside you, and you don't really think about why. And in China, you're not encouraged to ask questions regarding any kind of political topic. You just accept it. So you just remember, you go to school and you just remember how the policy was good. And then when you take exam, you just write down all those answers, why it's good and how it's good. And there's no critical thinking. But for people who have siblings, you have this kind of, you always feel a little bit shame. It's just like, there's no chance to talk about it. Yeah, that's how, it's not until we got involved in this film we start to unpack like all those things that we grow up with us, and then learn more. By making a film, we not only know about the policy, but also ourselves, and also especially for Nan Fu, she had the chance to talk with all her families.
Certainly personal for her. It must have been very personal for you as well. And I'm trying to imagine, did you have the similar kind of conversation that she did with your own parents? And I'm wondering if you got the same kinds of answers, like, well, it was necessary. People would have been cannibalized. Did you have the same kinds of conversations, I guess?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't really talk about my work with my parents because I just tell them, okay, I make films, and then it's easy, and then I just don't like to talk about like human rights thing. And then one time I went to China, I told them, oh, I'm going to Jiangxi province to meet my colleague and my friend from the US. She's doing a film. I'm going to join her. And they asked me, what's the film about? I said, it's a film about her family. And then I just don't go deeper into those kind of topic. And it's just like, it's hard to talk about.
Why, because they'll worry?
Huh?
They'll worry?
Yeah, they will worry about me. And then they think that a girl shouldn't be a troublemaker, like criticizing the government. And then, yeah, they just don't like me doing that kind of job. And then But yeah, I can imagine that if I show the film to them, they will really agree. I mean, I can, because they've been through a lot, and then they don't really have a chance, like really reflect on the past, and people don't like to think about the past. I mean, in my family, so I just haven't had that kind of conversation yet. Maybe someday in the future, yeah.
One of the things we talked about with Nanfu was, I mean, this was the second film where she's taken a critical look at the Chinese government and Chinese policies. Hooligan Sparrow, by the way, if you haven't seen, is terrific. And so I know that she worried about going back. She managed to go back because she had a son. But I wonder how you're thinking about going back. I'm wondering how you're thinking about your relationship now with your parents or with China, like after something like this that does reveal some unpleasant things about the policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I will. I think I can go back because I'm a Chinese citizen, so you can go back. So the only thing you worry about is that you cannot come out. You cannot come back because
you can go back. You're not sure if you can come back here.
Yeah. So, because it happened to some activists that they got detained and something. But for this, I think there's some kind. Of course, you never know until it happens. But there has been like some kind of boundary. You kind of know like when you really get into big troubles. And I mean, the government will be more aggressive when they find out you're actively doing something. So, for example, you go back to film another film about human rights, then I will be very worried because I will be monitored. But if I just go back, it should be fine, yeah. Or if I contact some human rights activist, and these people usually their phone will tap, and then they say, "Oh, it's you again." Maybe they will just show up and ask questions. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the question that comes up in the film. That conflict between people who are, I mean, you had on one hand the family planning official, the woman who was given these awards, and she was quite proud of the work that she had done, saw that what she was doing was in the interest of a bigger cause of the state. And then the midwife, who didn't think that way, was trying to atone for what she called her sins during that time. And I'm wondering, talk a little bit about that, if you would. What you encountered about people who, how much do people talk about that conflict between their own personal conscience and what they're supposed to be doing for the state?
I think you see the difference between the two characters, but actually, for me, I personally more see the similarities between them. I mean, the official who won a lot of awards, you can see her that she actually struggles inside, and she's haunted by the past, but she had to present it herself that way because she's used to, and she was supposed to do that, and she benefited from that, having a good job and all those benefits, and yeah, for the midwife, yeah, she's atoning for her sins, but in one of the questions Nanfu asked, like, have you ever thought about quitting? And she said, I will quit when I retire. So she did that job for over 25 years, and then nobody really told her that she doesn't have to go to prison. She wouldn't have to go to prison if she stopped doing that, but she's still doing that. So she, I mean, she's kind of, I keep thinking of why. I think for the midwife, her primary role is official. She a Communist Party member, and she had to fulfill that obligation first before she is a human being. And it's the same with the other officials. So there's a lot of, and also they are before we made the film, we said we're going to meet some perpetrator and people who enforce the policy, but when we meet them, when Nanfu meet the midwife, and then And then they all turn out to be like very ordinary person. They can be your neighbor, your aunt. And I can see myself being one of them if I stay in China and I just want to be good and be recognized by the party. And it can be me too. If I didn't go abroad, if I live in that generation, and anyone can become a perpetrator. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the challenges you and Nanfu may have encountered. What was the hardest part about making a film like this, do you think?
I think we did talk a lot about the production part, and how we just have to avoid being discovered by the government. And then also Brian's wife, Lan, she was in China. In that town where the government confiscated baby, she got into big trouble with the government. And when I go back the second time, I was already tapped, and my phone was already tapped. And then,
wow.
Yeah, the production part, there's a lot of challenge. And also for Nanfu, she cannot, we are not sure if Hurricane Sparrow, after that, if she was on the government's radar. So she has to avoid checking in hotel or taking trains or airplanes, because we have China have a system that require the ID, like checking real ID, and then if she's on the list, the local authority will be alerted, and we just have to take all those things into consideration. So it's a meticulous process of planning for a trip, like what even include what cars you should hire, and then how many, just like very like you sometimes we hire a car from a city like 1,000 miles away. It's very expensive, but sometimes because you don't want a local car, and because once anything happens, they can go to a local driver and then get any information they want.
Wow.
But sometimes you have to think about it. Okay, if you hire a car from other places, but you go to this village, but this village only has one narrow path, and then it's too obvious if you have a car with a license from other province. So maybe it's a better idea to hire a local taxi. So you just have to talk to local contacts, and then you just have to make every step very carefully.
What did they think you were filming?
Okay, yeah.
What did you tell them that you were filming or doing?
Oh, yeah, we did. After when running into trouble, I go back to that town where I met the twin. Like, that's the first time we met her, when she, in the film, when she talked about how she wished to be her twin sister. And actually, after that trip, I went back to Beijing, and then, the police did call me and asked me what you are doing. And then I said, I'm just a volunteer helping, like adoptees from the US. They want to look for their birth parents, and then I'm just helping them. And they would say, oh, according to our information, you're lying. And then I say, well, that's what I did. And then I don't know, but anyway, it just.
Whatever you did, it worked, right?
Huh?
It worked, whatever you were telling them?
They were not very aggressive. They just tried to collect information. And they were not like, I mean, I got away,
Got away. Brian, I wanted to ask you, give us a sense. So I was looking at some information earlier about the State Department numbers, and I'm not sure if these are even accurate, but 64,043 Chinese children adopted in the United States between 1999 and 2010. Give us a sense of what you know now about the numbers and the scope of the issue here. Can you give us a sense of the scale of all of this?
Scale in respect to?
How much of this has happened? How much of this do you think is trafficking in children? How much of this might be just legitimate adoptions? How you manage to decide between the two,
Well, you don't know until you locate the birth family. That's ultimately how you learn what the true story is. The China International Adoption Program started in 1992 with just about 100 to 200 children being adopted. like practically every international adoption program, there was a need that was perceived to find homes for children. And as the Western money flowed into the orphanages, the demand from the West for these kids very quickly exceeded the organic supply of the children. And so the directors of these orphanages quickly figured out that, hey, if I can get more kids into my orphanage, then I'll be able to adopt more kids and make more money, ostensibly to improve the facilities and hire more caregivers and stuff like that. So from 1992 at about 200, by the time we hit 2000, it was close to 8,000 or 9,000 per year, and then in the peak at 2005, it hit 15,000. And then the scandal that was portrayed in the film occurred, and the numbers dropped until now it's about 3,000 per year. How many of those kids came into the orphanages through portrayed? Obviously we don't know with certainty, but there are characteristics that you can look at, like we talked about in the film, that kind of lead us to indicate that probably 80 to 85% of the children came from orphanages that employed extra legal methods of obtaining children, to put it as charitably as possible.
Yeah. How did you react when it first occurred to you and your wife that it was possible that a child you had adopted had been possibly either forcibly taken from their parent, or there had been some suspicious circumstances around it? Like, what was your, like, just personal reaction? How were you thinking about it in those initial days?
Understand is that, and I think I can safely say that the majority, vast, overwhelming majority of families that went to China to adopted out of a sense that they were doing something good, that they were providing a home for a child. And so that's the reason I went. And so when you find out down the road that the story that you were told, which is in a very real sense, a spiritual story, it's a family myth, it's part of your identity as a family. When you find out that that's probably not what happened, it can be quite devastating. And so, my wife and I, are always trying to find the birth families for our own children to at least, like the twin, bring peace to them, to know that their child is alive, that they're happy, that they are, to kind of overcome that anxiety that every birth family we've ever met has. And that is, what happened to my child? Where are they? Are they even alive? Because they don't know. As far as they're concerned, they vanish into thin air. And so it can be deeply distressing to find out that things were not the way we were told.
Did you feel, in your conversations with other birth parents or rather with other adoptive parents, do you feel a sense of obligation to do something about this? Do you feel, and is everyone, not everyone, but do many people, adoptive parents, do they go into this same kind of work that you've done? It's pretty remarkable, I have to say, and I'm just wondering, is it a sense of obligation? Is it to correct something? Is it to just find out what had happened to these children?
For us, or for the other?
For you.
For us. The collection of the DNA of the birth families is just a mission.
Yeah.
It's a way to reconcile the emotional and familial rip that occurred when the child was brought into the orphanage. And so every time we make a match of a birth family to an adoptee, we feel like we've started a healing process. And that's deeply satisfying. The birth parents, when we call them and tell them we've we found your child, the response is always just an outpouring of deep emotion on the part of the birth family. As Lon pointed out in the film, though, not every adoptee is ready to cross that bridge. And so, and that's because, you know, they've been told a story, and they've internalized that story, and it's caused them to sometimes feel a bitterness, maybe a sense of rejection that the adoption story has told them about their birth family. And so sometimes it takes time for them to reprogram themselves to understand, yeah, that story isn't what happened. And the door is open for you to learn the true story. And so sometimes it takes a year or more for the adoptee to come back and say, I'm ready.
What difference does a film like this make, where there's transparency, where there's now a telling of this really difficult story? What difference has it made for your life and the work that you are doing, that the story is getting out there, that there's some scrutiny for certain behaviors, certain official behaviors, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, when Jialing contacted Lon about participating in the documentary, the first question that Lon and I asked each other is, how will this be perceived by the adoption community?
Yeah.
We want the adoptees, our primary focus was for the adoptees to have that light bulb go off, you know, that sense of, maybe everything I've believed all my life, maybe I should reevaluate that, maybe I should investigate that, maybe I should come into this a little bit more open-minded. And Nanfu and Jialing beautifully did that. I mean, we get communications daily from adoptees that have seen the film and said, I had no idea that this could be a part of my story. Help me, you know, to find my birth family. So there's conversions, if you will, occurring, and that's what makes this film so powerful for us.
What's your work life on a day-to-day basis, and what can people do to help you?
Day-to-day basis. Yeah, I mean, it's primarily my wife does most of the in-China contacting, and the challenges are, you know, these birth families, somebody approaches them and says, hey, we're going to test you for free. We're going to try to find your child. And the birth families, part of them are like, what's the angle? You know, what's the scam?
Yeah.
Are you going to come back and ask money? You know, I mean, China is a very cynical country because everybody is trying to game everything. And so the primary challenge is to convince the birth families, no, we are on your side here. We want to help you. Just give us your DNA. And then the adoptees, prior to this film, the adoptees, when they get a match, they're like dumbfounded and don't believe it's possible. You know, they're like, this can't be true that I submit my DNA to a database and all of a sudden it shows my birth mother's there. How can that be? So we have to go through the whole educating of the adoptee, and that's what the film has really helped with, is when the adoptee sees it, there's no longer that feeling of disbelief and skepticism. They're much more receptive to the information. But on a day-to-day basis, it's just contacting birth families all day long.
All day long.
All day long. I should say all night long.
Because you have a day job. Jialing, I wanted to ask you about the question of the larger consequences that came up in the film there at the end. The impacts of this policy now being felt as these children have grown older, as now generations are passing along, not enough to care for the elderly. What are the consequences? What is China, I mean, do we have a sense of the consequences of a policy like that now?
Yeah, I think the Chinese government is very aware of the consequences. That's why they're changing the policy to two-child policy, and there have been some kind of talks that maybe the policy will totally be lifted forever, be abandoned. So yeah, the society is aging, and China has too many men for women, and then we don't have enough labor for the economy, and all these are the consequences of the one-child policy. But the reason why the Chinese government now change it to two-child policy, or in the future if they totally abandon the policy, the reason is not because they are aware of the human rights violation or any kind of devastating consequence that happened to the whole generation of China or anything. It's not. It's just that they think that the economy needs you to need more labor, and then we need more balance, a more balanced, a more healthier demography to boost the economy. So the mentality does not really change. It's not that they realize that fertility right is a basic human right. There's no discussion in China about that, and then all the discussion that you see in media or in public, any kind of information you get in China is that now we need to develop an economy, and now we need you to have more children.
So they didn't really learn their lesson.
They learn, it depends how you define Western lesson. They do learn it from the consequence on the economy, but not.
But they don't admit they're learning a lesson. They just shifting tactics.
They just shift the tone that say now the government is making another wise decision, because now we realize that time has changed, and then this is it's another promotional campaign, like how wise the government is to be able to adjust to the demand of the time. And it's not like, oh, we admit that we made a mistake. No, there's a myth that the infallibility of the Communist Party, they don't make mistake. That's like, they never admit there was a lesson to learn.
Yeah. You know, I mean, you hit on it just a little bit. You know, we in the United States, we're very used to every 4 years or every 8 years getting a new leadership, and they can easily just undo everything that the previous administration did. And there's no loss of faith or loss of face on the part of Americans. We're used to that. We expect it almost. But in China, the trust of the people to the national government is what allows the national government to continue to exist. And so it's a much slower change. You know, as much as the Chinese government today would like to say, boy, we really need to speed up the baby production in the country, but we can't, because if we say that, then people are going to say, well, wait a second, 5 years ago we could only have one kid, and now you're changing, and it loses face and it loses confidence. And so they're forced by the very structure and the trust of the people to move very, very slowly. I mean, they've got the two-child policy now, but it's going to be 20 years before they will admit that times have changed again to allow it to open up even more, even though they would want to, but they can't.
How are you reacting to what you were seeing about the, not just the really difficult stories like Nanfu's uncle and her aunt that were really gut-wrenching, but when you hear her mother, who knew the details of some of these stories, say, look, it was bad, but it was for the best. Like, how did you react to that part of that story?
I haven't lived in China. My wife was raised before the one-child policy came into place. One of the fascinating things about the film for me is watching Nanfu's face of literal disbelief when literally everybody she talks to says, this was a good thing. And she's like, what is wrong with you? Why don't you see things my way? And I just wonder if Nanfu has ever stopped and said, maybe I need to change and see things their way. I mean, they went through the famines. They went through, the people in her family went through the, Mao's policies and stuff like that. And she's kind of a latecomer to the game, and so I find, when she's interviewing, especially her mom, it's interesting to watch her face as she's just like wanting to reach out and say, why don't you see things the way I see them? And I'm sure her mom's saying, why don't you see things the way I see them?
Yeah.
And that disconnect is fascinating. It's an interesting tension in the film.
Jialing, Nanfu said that making the film for her was a bit like therapy. Yeah. Is that true for you?
Uh, I don't think so because I don't, unlike her, I didn't really interview my family. And for her, like she grew up with all those stories and I mean, I think she heard about those stories. She didn't know the details. And then for her, yeah, to go into those that deep into the conversation as an adult with her family, it was a therapy for her. But for me, like at the beginning, there's so many things that may upset me, like the baby, the fetus in the drawer. I couldn't look at it in the editing room. I just never wanted to edit that footage. Like I did some of the editing too. That it's just so hard on me. And then later we decided we need to go back and with some more lighting, and then we need to film show the dignity of the fetus. It's a beautiful life, and it should have been a beautiful life. And then you represented it again, and then it was kind of that every time I look at it, I have the sense that there was a light there, it's beautiful, and then it's kind of that process. Maybe it was a therapy, and then at the beginning I judged a lot of the parents who abandoned their kids. I would say, how could you ever sleep when you abandon your girl when in the street? And then you meet a lot of those people, and then you try to put yourself in their circumstances, and you realize maybe I wouldn't have done anything better if I were in their situation. So that's kind of realization. So maybe it was a therapy in that sense.
Do you think, I don't know, do you think making the film will open a door for you to have conversations with your family about this? And you're trying to we can't talk about this stuff. And I think a lot of Americans can relate to that when they go to Thanksgiving and don't want to talk about the presidential election. Like there's some stuff like you just can't talk to some people about. But I wonder if this will open a door for you to be able to find ways that may be related to this, or do you really, are you ready for that yet?
I see every family is different, and I'm happy the way we are. And then maybe there's a moment when you feel that you want to tell. I mean, because I believe that they would say the same thing, like non-forced mom is necessary, and what choice do you have? That I kind of know what they would say, but sometimes, it depends whether the opportunities will come up and you feel it's the right moment.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, I was intrigued by the dialogue about the worth of young men compared to young women. And I'm curious if in China there's a women's movement or some kind of movement to respect both genders equally.
Some kind of movement to respect?
Just between families really wanting boys compared to girls. I'm curious if young girls in China are empowered to say, hey, we're important too, or I don't know how to say it.
Is that changing, that idea that, the idea that you gotta have a boy, like her grandfather, is that changing at all? And are you seeing kind of a women's movement in China growing to say just that, like we have the same value as the boys? Are you seeing any of that in China as far as you can tell?
But actually a lot of girls who grow up in the city, they're the only child in the family, and a lot of other resources are pour on these girls' education, and they did benefit from the one-child policy, and there are a lot of my friends who study here, they're the only child, and if the family have other boys, maybe they wouldn't have the chance. But speaking of movement, I don't think there's a lot of women activists in China about all kinds of issues, but I don't think there's a movement that specifically target on this perspective, and a lot of young women in China have the chance to get a very good education now. So in general, like Nanfu and I, like in general, like, there's some kind of awareness, like you don't have to speak out, but you know that you are important. Like, yeah, but the idea of boys, preference on boys is so strong culturally. I mean, like even in my hometown, like there are a lot of temple events. Like if you don't have a boy in the family, you don't really participate in those traditional ceremonies. So you kind of feel excluded. So the idea is so strong, I mean, culturally, so it's hard to change that.
My husband and I have lived in Beijing for 5 of the last 10 years. And as we look at the impact of the one-child policy, what you just said about the women, I said to my husband, I said, I've got to go and make this comment. We are so impressed with the caliber of professional women in the larger cities. They are competent, they are well-spoken, they are polished, they are incredibly well-educated. On the flip side, as a Westerner, we have a little thing that we say about a lot of the young men, and we say it's the little emperor syndrome. And they are so spoiled, they are so doted over, and everything is done for them that many of the young men in the society do not know how to work, do not know how to think for themselves, are not as competent as these extraordinary women. And so there are so many societal impacts of this one-child policy that are so far-reaching that this film just barely, it opens up the box of the impact that it's had on society. So,
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you all for coming tonight. We're really grateful. Thank you, Jialing Zhang. Thank you very much. Congratulations. Brian Stye, thank you.
Thank you.
For your good work. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.